Okay, so the talk today is going to be about balance. We'll be talking about juggling family with high acuity patients that seem to need us more. And this is, a very common issue for people that are in the mission field, because most of the places that people are going are places where access to healthcare is very difficult. So I'm going to mostly talk about Malawi because that's where I'm coming from. And so what kind of issues do we deal with in the countries where we serve? So Malawi, for example, has a population of about 18 million people. And 48% of Malawi's population is actually less than 50. So that tells you that people aren't living very long. 1 in 16 children don't survive to age 5. And 80% of the population lives in the rural areas. And the average income is about $1.25 a day. In Malawi, only about 11% of households have electricity, and 23% of women have a secondary school education, and about 32% of men. And life expectancy in Malawi right now, from the data from WHO in 2018, was about 64. There are about 300 physicians total in the whole country, and you can imagine 18 million people with 300 physicians. So that's about 1 doctor per 60,000 people. Malawi's maternal mortality is one of the highest in the world, 439 per 100,000 live births. 29% of all these births are actually in adolescents, and those account for about 15% of all the maternal deaths that we see. Neonatal mortality is also high, 29 in 1,000 live births, and usually this is from asphyxia, prematurity, and infection. And again, like we talked about before, only 1 in 16 children don't survive to age 5. And this is largely from malaria, diarrhea, and pneumonia. So meet one of my friends that actually lives in Chad. This is Dr. Dana Nederberg. She and her family moved to Chad, Africa, where they're serving in a very rural setting. She has 4 children that she moved from the United States to a cross-cultural setting. Her husband, Olin, is actually an ER physician. As an OBGYN, Dana is really the only person that's trained to do any sort of surgical care in that area. So she went from just being an OBGYN into the United States to becoming a general surgeon there, a trauma surgeon there. She's an orthopedic surgeon. She's a pediatric surgeon. She's a urologist, because there's no one else who could do any of those procedures, so she's had to learn out of necessity to perform them. Her husband, who's actually ER, because some of the patients that come through the ER need to be sedated at times for procedures that are done in the ER. They know how to intubate. He's actually become her anesthesiologist in Chad. So Dana and I were talking about these issues of balance, and she was talking to me about a situation one day where in the middle of the night, there was an emergency that came in. That young lady that you see at the top had had a bowel perforation from a typhoid infection. She had gone to multiple different places. She had had multiple different surgical procedures, and she kept leaking and had not been able to eat, was severely malnourished, and by the time they were bringing her to the hospital, she couldn't actually sit on her own. She was dying. They had a 2-year-old who was in the house. They had no babysitter, and both mom and dad were needed because this young lady actually needed surgery. So what do you decide at that point? So Dana told me they did a hard thing. They actually locked up the baby in their house, and they both left their 2-year-old by himself, and they went to take care of this young woman who, at the bottom of that, you see a picture, is now young and healthy, but at what expense did they do that? Then this is me. I went on a short-term medical mission to Malawi with a group and surgical mission trip. This time I decided to bring my children to Malawi for the first time. They wanted to spend time with my side of the family, my parents and cousins, and get to know my other side of the family. They also wanted to experience Malawi with their mom, because that's where I'm from. I, on the other hand, was in the hospital. I have a woman, as you see me there at the top, who had a ruptured uterus that needed to be repaired urgently. I thought I was going to do the fistula repair, but instead I had to take care of the ruptured uterus. This woman had actually delivered a dead baby just before that. And then I had this other woman that had been waiting for me who had had a fistula for about 15 years and had been waiting to get her life back. She knew we were coming. She had waited for us. She actually had been sleeping under a tree in the hospital to make sure she makes it to the front of the line. So do I go spend time with my kids? Do I go experience time with my, children in Malawi, or do I choose her? So I chose the patients. And those are the decisions that we struggle with all the time. At what point do you decide you're going to do things with your family? At what point do your patients take priority, especially in settings like this? So similar to Dana and her husband, I ended up deciding, they can always have another trip, another time where we can do those things. It's just not this one. I think I clicked the wrong button. I'm sorry. Does that mess up your recording? Sorry. I think I clicked the wrong button, so either I turned it off completely. Like I actually have an empty slide? Yeah, so I did that one, then that one. Yeah, and then it should be this one. Okay, so what about the myths? Oh, okay, so I have to wait. So what about some of the myths that we have about having it all? Everybody talks about women going out into the world and having it all. What does that really mean? So this is actually a picture of myself here in my office trying to have it all. So I have a phone call, I'm trying to dictate, my phone is going off, and I'm trying to drink coffee all at the same time. So what does it really mean? What is really the untruths that are in the idea of having it all that we need to kind of look at? So it does increase this idea of self-worth and self-sufficiency. It shows people think that this is, shows that you're very dedicated to what you do. Everybody thinks it makes you more valuable to whoever you're trying to be valuable to. It makes you successful, because if you're not trying to have it all, you're not going to have success. It also shows that you have no limitations. There's nothing that can stop you. You're unstoppable. And choosing family generally looks to everybody else on the outside that you don't value your work, and you're not dedicated to it, and you're not dedicated to your success. So what does the Bible say really about this? Psalm 127:2 discusses how it is useless for you to work so hard from early morning until late at night, anxiously for food to eat, for God gives rest to his loved ones. And then Proverbs 23:4 tells us, don't wear yourself out trying to get rich. Be wise enough to know when to quit. Oh, gosh. All right, so what are the downfalls of trying to have it all? I think the more we try to have it all and feel like we're self-sufficient and we can do everything, it does increase that savior and God complex mentality. It also limits the development of other people's talents that could actually make up for what your limitations are and what your deficiencies are. It also takes away from the focus that God really has for you, because you're trying to do what God called you to do and what he might have called everybody else to do. What then? So one of the things I always try to think about, and I got some of this wisdom from some of my friends that have been on the mission field, some of them 10 years, 20 years, 5 years, short term and long term. One of the girls mentioned, we all have dreams and things that we want to accomplish in a lifetime, but one of the things we need to remember is that we don't have to do it all at once. Ecclesiastes 3:1 does tell us there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. So it is important, I think, in keeping that in mind, that it's better to probably divide your life into seasons, and then each season as its own priority. And so once you create the season of your life and what the priorities of that season are, it will allow you to accomplish all those things that you feel you want to accomplish in your life without neglecting other things. So what, more of that. So this was a quote from just a circular writer that I found interesting. It says, many things we need can actually wait. The child cannot. Now is the time his bones are formed, his mind developed. To him we cannot say tomorrow, because his name is actually today. So when children are young, especially in cross-cultural settings, where they feel they're displaced, they need us just as much as our high acuity patients, it's important for them to not feel like only your patients are taking, the center stage. Because if they really grow up to feel that your patients are always more important than they are, then you have failed your first and most important mission and ministry, which is really to raise your children to know God and to love others. So these are actually my kids on their second day of school, because I actually missed the first day of school work. So this is to myself. So Luke 4, verse 31 to 44, I would just kind of summarize what happened in there. So Jesus is actually doing some clinical work. I take that as a very good example for us as physicians and nurses and people in the medical field. But, he was healing people for this particular time. And so he healed Simon's wife's mother. Then she had a high fever. They sat down, they ate. And then, the Sabbath was coming. The sun was setting. There were more and more people coming. He healed them. He cast out demons. At the end of the day, the next morning, he actually got up and went to a deserted place. But there were still many people coming to him and asking him not to go away, because there were still more healings to be done. And his response was, I must preach to the kingdom of God to other cities also, because for this purpose I have been sent. So he actually knew to create margins around his clinical work, because his first purpose wasn't to just come and do a healing ministry. He was actually there to teach people about the eternal life that God was going to give them. So at some point, he had to be able to say no with love and let them know that the greater purpose was for him to continue to spread the ministry even to other cities. So, this was a very good model for me to remember that a healthy balance is important, including rest, taking time for Sunday services, and then just having some time alone even with God. So, clinical practices should always be as valued as family and children, especially when the kids are very young. Children have a very limited ability to express their emotions, especially in cross-cultural settings, and they may display their emotions with anger, stubbornness. They may have emotional instability while they're there, and they're not able to really communicate their anxiety, so they tend to act it out. So you have to learn how to give your children grace and some understanding, and avoid finding yourself being harsh, trying to discipline them, punish them, because it's more important that you focus on the other work. I have a phrase I often catch myself saying to my kids when they're demanding something of me and I'm in the middle of helping people that are dying and they need me more urgently. I look at them and I say, can you just suffer a little? Because for me, I feel like their suffering for their attention for me is not as much as it could be for a girl that's got a bowel perforation and needs me to repair it. But I think what's important is that the children may need more of me, especially when they're in a cross-cultural setting, than actually they would at home, because they just don't feel at home and they feel a little bit displaced. So it's important to have that balance and understanding of that. So one of the things I also see that's very helpful is to have more of a long-term mentality and not one of those where I just want to survive today. Let's make the most of today and we'll let tomorrow take care of itself. So I think a lot of times when you go in the mission field with that, mindset, you tend to be doing everything and just surviving every day, but you're not thinking, what do I really want out of this ministry and the vision that we came in here with for long term? Because the truth of the matter is you're never going to be able to see all the patients that need to be seen. I have some pictures here of patients that are in lines and they keep coming 200 to 300 patients a day. You're never going to be able to see everybody and cure everybody. And you will never be able to effectively connect with the people in the community. A lot of times you can't really, for people that are coming in from the outside into a community that's new to them, you're not going to be able to connect with them the same way like a local person would be able to. So that's something to kind of keep in mind and remember. So, and the likelihood is very high that some of us that have moved to these countries to spend long-term missions, that we're probably not going to stay there until the day we die. There's a lot of things that happen where people come in with all the intentions of spending maybe 20 years, but their children start having problems that require that they come home. Sometimes the retirement comes in the way, or maybe aging parents that need you to go back home and take care of them. Serious illnesses where you have no access to modern health care and you want to come back home and take care of it. So if you're not thinking about those situations and preparing for those situations and trying to be the answer for everything, that's also one of the reasons why you end up overextending yourself. So multiplication of skills, vision, and ministry is really essential in long-term planning when you're on the mission field. So parts of the medical and surgical mission trip visions should foster, nurture, and cultivate local, sustainable, and long-term vision in the meaningful way for your local partners. The missionary doctor really should be a facilitator, strengthening the local capacity, equipping them for long-term function as Christian physicians and surgeons. Try to avoid having this savior mentality where you want to forever be the only doctor that's needed. You should actually work every day to work yourself out of the job, to be needed less, so you can actually spend more time at home because you've left the local doctors to take care of most of the issues that your patients are having, because you've trained them, you've facilitated them, you've empowered them to be able to take care of their own. So accept that you can't have it all or do it all, because God is the one and only who actually can do it all. You cannot serve apart from God, because he will take care of that which you leave undone. So you got to trust your patients in the hands of God when you need to choose your children, as you would also have to trust your children in the hands of God during the times that you have to choose your patients. So I'm just showing this example of a picture of one of the surgeons. He actually had to do an amputation with a saw that we sterilized. And I remember him just being so sweaty and exhausted by the end of that. And there were more cases coming in. And literally, he had to get from that and go to the next case. And these things happen often. So you have to figure out, where do you stop? Where do you let God take over? One of the things is it's important to also make time to rest and use it to spend more time with the children. And when you leave work, you got to leave it at work. It's also important to involve the children in the ministry, because I think that whatever is age appropriate for them, they can participate and they're able to see what it is that you're doing in the mission field. And it also helps them really see how God can work through you and work through them in order to answer some of these problems that we were discussing at the beginning. And one of the verses I usually like to use often, when I'm anxious about whether or not I'm going to be able to get around everything, take care of everybody, whether I'm going to leave somebody uncared for, is to remember Philippians 4 verse 6, which says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God."